So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NCVO's Board Behaviours Workshop. I'm Kate Lee. I'm the Chief Executive of NCVO, and we are running this event as part of Trustees, our Trustees Week programme. And it's my first event that I am introducing as Chief Exec of NCVO. So, what a great way for me to kick off my tenure at NCVO, introducing something in Trustees Week. The workshop is all about exploring how the refreshed Charity Governance Code can help foster a healthier and more inclusive board culture, incredibly important. We'll be looking at trustee behaviours, sharing challenges and gathering insights, which will also strengthen NCVO's own governance resources. So something in it for you, definitely something in it for us. Now, we're joined today by 120 trustees and charity leaders from across the sector. I'm a bit sad I can't join you for the whole thing now because it sounds like there's going to be some great discussions going on. And here's what you can expect over the next 90 minutes. So we're going to begin with a keynote speech from Sally Stevens, NCVO's Senior Governance Consultant, who will introduce the updated Charity Governance Code. So don't worry if you don't know anything about it. You will by the end of this 90 minutes. And share reflections on why board behaviours matter and the relationship between those board behaviours and the effectiveness of their organisation. So after Sally's talk, we're going to open the floor to Q&A. So please make sure you're scribbling on your pad questions as you're going along, or shove them in the chat as we go down, and we'll take some of those questions at that point. Then we'll move on into breakout rooms where we'll explore some real world governance scenarios. That's where all the juicy gossip's going to go on. That's where I wish I was with you, with fellow trustees. Our facilitators will guide the discussion and capture some key insights, which we'll be able to share back for everyone. We'll reconvene to share reflections and wrap up with a closing poll. And just a few quick notes, a bit of housekeeping. I don't know why I've been trusted with housekeeping, but anyway, I'm bound to get this wrong, but we'll give it a go. Presumably, if there's a fire, you know where your own exits are, as most people must be probably at home. Closed captions are enabled, and you can turn these on or off by clicking the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I don't know what that means. Someone told me to say that. I'm sure you can all follow it. The slides we're using will be shared in the chat shortly, and feel free to download them now and zoom in on them if that's helpful, if you need help with visual impairment. The session runs through to 3:30. There isn't a formal break, but if, like me, you can't go 90 minutes without a wee at this time of day, please just slip away and come back, obviously. So most importantly, this is your space, and please share comments and reflections in the chat or put questions in the Q&A box throughout the Q&A session. No question is too strange or weird or unusual. And often when people ask like questions that they're pondering on, everyone else in the room thinks, oh, I wish I'd asked that. So please be brave and put in exactly what you need an answer to help you improve board dynamics in your own organisation. So today we're joined by Alison Denham and Roger Chapman from Trusted Standard, which is one of NCVO's trusted suppliers, and they'll be facilitating 2 of our breakout rooms. Welcome to Alison and Roger. Just a little bit more about Trusted Standard for those of you that don't know. It's a quality assurance framework which is designed specifically for the voluntary sector. It helps charities assess and improve their governance, leadership and operational effectiveness. So whether you're small, local or a big national charity, Trusted Standard offers a structured way to reflect on how your organisation is run and where it can grow. Their approach is rooted in sector values and practical experience, and it makes them really ideal partners for us today in these discussions. So many thanks again for joining us. Now, to get us started, I'm pleased to hand over to Sally, who as I say, is NCVO's Senior Governance Consultant, and who will introduce the refreshed Charity Governance Code to share about why board behaviours are so central. Sally, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for a brilliant introduction there to our second big community event as part of Trustees Week, our 3rd overall. And it's delightful to have you all here with us to talk about what is a really important topic to us. We know that behaviours really do matter when it comes to being an effective board. And as I launch into that, it's probably worth saying, who are we to say that we know that? Well, as NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, we have over 17,000 charity members, and we work with you all really actively to understand what it's like to be a charity, to be operating in 2025. And we do that in lots of different ways, including through our practical support help desk, who take calls and emails with all kinds of queries and questions from trustees, from staff members, and all kinds of people involved in charities. Our training, and we train thousands of trustees per year. And then our consultancy, and in our governance consultancy, we work with 50 to 60 organisations per year, looking in depth at what good decision making and good governance looks like in those organisations, what structures, processes, and behaviours enable that. And so we're really well placed to make the big statement to say behaviours really do matter when it comes to delivering good decision making in our organisations. Governance is fundamentally really human led. It is not just an administrative process. It's not just bureaucracy. It's about people being able to come together, be really effective in driving forward your organisations with passion and enthusiasm. So because we've got humans involved, the way those humans behave is going to be a part of the dynamic. We also know that the best decisions are made through discussion. We benefit in the charity sector from boards that are not just one person acting unilaterally. We always have multiple trustees on a board. And it's vital that we're able to benefit from a range of voices, a range of perspectives that we can value and hear in discussion in order to drive our decisions forward. And so when we see a lack of positive behaviours or any gaps there, what we find is that that might start to create some misalignment in our governance team, whether that's between our board and our staff, if we have them, our board and our volunteers, or even between individual trustees. And that misalignment, that misunderstanding, is the starting point for mistrust. It can lead to disputes where challenge stops being constructive and starts just being destructive, and that prevents decision making. And a fundamental part of governance is that we're making decisions in order to move our organisations forward. And what we often find is that where behaviours are poor, people feel misunderstood. They stop feeling valued, and then they stop engaging. And we simply can't manage that in our sector as it is. We rely so heavily on our expert and well-equipped team of volunteers to take our organisations forward and bring that passion, that skill, and that expertise into everything that they do. When people don't feel valued, they stop bringing that energy and enthusiasm forward. And that ultimately makes it so much more difficult for us to ensure that our charities can continue to be led effectively and can continue to move forward. So behaviours really do matter when it comes to delivering good governance. There is no rule book for governance which is going to overtake the fact that we are at heart a human-led, practice-driven discipline. So this has been reflected in the new Charity Governance Code. The Charity Governance Code is a tool for the sector. It was first developed in 2003, and then it was redeveloped in 2017, 2020, and this week we have launched the 2025 version of that code. When I say we, I don't mean us at NCVO because it's not owned by NCVO. The Charity Governance Code is a sector-wide code, co-created by a cross-sector steering group, all of whom are people that are volunteering from their organisations to give their time to look at creating and maintaining this tool. And that steering group is led by an independent chair who oversees how the code is constructed. The code's not a piece of legislation, it's not a requirement in law that charities adopt it, but it is recommended by the Charity Commission as our primary regulator that all charities do follow a code of good governance if they can. And the Charity Governance Code is designed to work for any charitable organisation. In our 2020 version, we actually had two iterations of the code, one for small charities and one for large charities. But in our newly launched 2025 version, there is just one Charity Governance Code, and it's been intentionally designed to be accessible and appropriate to a charity of absolutely any size. So What's new in that new code? Well, this is what the code broadly looks like in format. We've retained the house structure that the steering group first came up with in 2017, with 8 principles forming the overall charity governance code. At the bottom, we have the foundation principle, which underpins all aspects of good governance. This is the understanding of what it means to be a trustee, what it means to be charitable, and the understanding of the landscape that we work within as organisations. We then have principles on organisational purpose. How do we define where we wish to go? How do we create a framework for that? What is our context for our strategic direction, our aims, and our expectations for the organisation? Leadership. How do we embody good leadership? How do we create a values framework that's meaningful for our organisation? And how do we work with other leaders to ensure that that is effective and appropriate to what we're doing as a charity? Ethics and culture is a new title for one of our principles. This principle previously was called integrity, and while many of the underpinning aspects have remained, we've retitled it to ethics and culture to reflect the fact that what we're talking about here is not to do with personal integrity, but is to do with the integrity of the decisions we make for our organisation, that they are ethical and that they are anchored in that values-led culture that we're seeking to lead. We have a principle on decision making, and this is a principle that has been split for the new version of the code, focusing entirely on what good practice in decision making should look like, not only in line with the Charity Commission's renewed guidance on that area and strengthened focus on principles of good decision making, but also recognising that this is a really fundamental aspect of what governance is, and it really deserves its own space within the code. We then have a new principle, the other part of what was decision-making, risk and control, is now its own space, managing resources and risk. And this looks at how, as leaders, you understand the capacity of the organisation, the resources, assets and attributes available to you, and how you deploy those, how you make use of them really effectively to manage your organisation, taking into appropriate consideration how you're thinking about risk. Not ever to be risk averse, but to be risk aware and considerate of the landscape that you're working in. Next, we have equity, diversity and inclusion, a slight language change there from the previous principle, which was equality, diversity and inclusion. We think the conversation has moved on past the notion of simply equality, but to equity. How do we bring people to a position where they have appropriate access to opportunities within our organisation? How do we allow a wide range of voices to be heard and to be influential in our decision making? And how are we inclusive of that wide range of voices? How do we ensure that not only are we welcoming diverse perspectives, but we're creating space for them when they arrive, whether that is at board level or elsewhere in our organisation? And finally, we have a principle on board effectiveness. How do we construct our boards so that they are appropriate and proportionate to the needs of our organisation? Thinking about the size and shape of that board, how people come to be on the board, how long they stay there, and what skills and training we might expect them to engage in order to continue to be the most effective decision makers possible. So that's an overview of what we have in the code. The code itself also comes with a slightly new format. So for each of these principles, what you'll find when you look at the code, which is downloadable from charitygovernancecode.org, is you will find a brief summary of the principle, a couple of lines articulating roughly what I've just said, hopefully. Then a set of 5 to 7 points which describe how you know this area of governance is working well for you. These are broad terms that should be able to apply to charities of absolutely any size. And they will say things like, for organisational purpose, as a board, you have an understanding of the direction in which the organisation is going. So broad statements, which are then underpinned, these descriptors of when it's working, by a series of recommended practice areas. And this is where we start seeing a massively renewed focus on this question of good behaviours, because our recommended practice is now split into 3 different sections. What behaviours would underpin this excellent governance? what types of policies, processes, or practice you might expect to engage in your organisation, and then any evidence or assurance that you could look to or call on to verify that you are achieving this area of governance. In each of those types of recommended practice, we also have the option for additional areas of practice for certain organisations which have particular characteristics. So while we don't have separate codes now for large and small charities, we do include additional practice where there is something that would be unique to a charity that has staff members, but might not apply to a charity that doesn't employ anyone. So we have those as additional areas of practice. And we have those for organisations with staff members, organisations with a membership, and a couple of other criteria where we recognise that there are slight differences in the recommended practice. All of that is supported by a range of tools and resources that are available through the website. And the intention in the long term is that we will be continually updating that pool of resources so that whatever that basic principle is that we're expecting you to meet in your governance, there is something current and up to date to support you in doing so. When we were reviewing the code and looking at the over 500 organisation responses to our consultation last year, two things really stood out to us as a steering group. Firstly, the desire for the code to be simpler and more accessible, which we hope we've achieved by having a reduced summary for the principle and only 5 to 7 key points under each of these areas. But also that there was significantly more guidance and support included. And that's where you see this expanded version of our recommended practice. No longer just setting out point by point things you may or may not do, but being specific where we recognise that something is more behavioural, something is more of a process, or something might be classed more as evidence or assurance. And we have each of those categories for all 8 of the principles. Now, as I said right at the start of this conversation, we have a real focus in this new code on behaviours. And there are good reasons for that. We recognise how important that human-led aspect of governance is and how vital good, engaged behaviours are to ensuring that we continue to move forward as organisations. Governance is a practice, and it does rely on the people involved to commit to some kind of agreed set of standards. Now, a challenge we have in our sector is there are very few rules for volunteers, and there are no real terms that set out what those agreed standards might be. So while we have some things that we can use to help us, things like the Nolan Principles of Public Life, there's no requirement for organisations to adhere to those standards. And even if you choose to look to those points as guidance for how you might behave, as an organisation, you still need to interpret those standards for public life. They're incredibly broad. We recognise that because volunteers are not paid employees, they are held to a different set of standards when it comes to how they engage with an organisation and how they might behave. And so the duty is on organisations themselves to start to set out those frameworks and understand in your context, what does good behaviour look like? And start to interpret some of those existing models. When we think about the Nolan principles, for example, they include a principle of honesty. But on an individual organisation level, we need to define for ourselves exactly what we mean by honest behaviours. Now, of course, it's easy to say, well, we don't want people to lie. That's quite a straightforward one. But do we want people to always tell all of the truth all of the time to everyone? That could be very honest, but it probably isn't adhering to some important principles of confidentiality that we might have. It's also probably not appropriate to share absolutely everything with every single one of our stakeholders at all times, and might be quite overwhelming. So just because we understand the concept of honesty as a standard of behaviour doesn't necessarily mean that it's straightforward to put that behaviour into practice. We need to do quite a lot of work as organisations to actually take the time to define what we mean when we say these broad behavioural terms and what they look like for us as we engage with one another. It's also fair to say that the way that boards engage with one another may be quite different from the expectations we have for how they engage with staff members in the organisation, whether those are more senior or more junior people, how those board members engage with other volunteers in the organisation, and even how those board members engage with our wider stakeholders, our funders, our grant makers, our partners, and to be honest, possibly our competitors. Sometimes we are working in a context where we may be interacting regularly with other charities or other similar organisations who we compete with. How do we engage with positive behaviours in those spaces? And what does that look like for us? Pardon me, for us collectively? Ultimately, we recognise that there is a big risk here because behavioural gaps can result in trustees becoming really disengaged. And visible behavioural gaps on your board can result in people choosing not to join your board at all. And in an environment where we know that hundreds of thousands of charities are carrying multiple vacancies on their boards, and it can be really challenging to find the best volunteers to lead our organisations, we have to take a lot of care not to hold ourselves back unnecessarily, just because we're not thinking about actually how we're outwardly displaying some of these key behaviours can have a real influence on our ability to be effective. That has been quite a whistle-stop tour of the new code and why we see behaviours as so important within it. We've now got about 10 minutes for any questions that you have on anything I've shared before we look at some case studies and do some peer-to-peer learning. So I'm happy to look at any questions. I can see that there is already something here in the Q&A from Nicola. Thank you, Nicola, which says, how do you ensure a fully inclusive board meeting environment? For example, what one person sees as fidgeting and distracting could be someone's way of coping. E.g. stims, which is stimulating motions often associated with being neurodivergent. Equally, where we find socializing where some find socializing an essential part of breaks, another may require time out on their own to avoid being overstimulated. And even within that neurodiverse community, needs will vary greatly. I think this is an excellent question, Nicola, primarily because it sets out the level of challenge we have here. It is not straightforward to create any space that is fully inclusive because we are a range of different people with a wide range of different needs. The best things that you could do to create the most inclusive space possible are to foster a sense that people are able to safely share their needs and their personal preferences, and that where people do share their needs and preferences, as much as possible will be done to accommodate those. Now, we have realities in life, whether needs are physical, emotional, other needs, that we may not be able to service every single person. Something that we find regularly in boards that are struggling to access a diverse range of people is that they hold their board meetings at a time that is quite difficult for individuals to engage with because of something about their personal background. So, for example, we may have a board that is primarily older retired people seeking to engage people who are younger, struggling to do so because they have all of their meetings during working hours. And that can be more difficult, particularly for early career people who might need to justify why they're taking that time off to their employer. So if we want to engage more early career people, it can be useful to position meetings at a time of day that's more accessible to them, which might be outside of 9 to 5 or might be on a weekend. Of course, the challenge here is, but what if you have people who are carers or who have other responsibilities that make evenings and weekends more difficult for them to accommodate? So it's quite difficult to serve all parties ever and be fully inclusive. What we can do is understand what are those diverse needs that exist in our group and how well can we seek to accommodate them, while also seeking to make sure that they're well understood. So if we have someone who fidgets and that's found to be distracting, is it less distracting if it's well understood why that person is doing that? and that it's not simply fidgeting, but actually being able to doodle is something that helps them concentrate. Being able to have the kind of psychological safety to share that openly can be in itself a really inclusive practice. If we have someone who typically arrives 5 minutes late and always needs to leave 5 minutes early, is that rudeness on their part, or is it to do with other responsibilities they have in their life and they're giving as much of their time as they can to be present in our space with us? And can fellow attendees willingly accommodate that and understand the reasons behind it? So I think when we talk about what fully inclusive looks like, really a significant part of that is about understanding different behaviours rather than expecting those behaviours not to exist. Got another question here from Susan, who says, what would the broad view be on the balance of spending time on team dynamics, working together, versus doing the actual work or business that's required? I think this is a good question. We need to hold both things in balance to a certain extent. And we use a model in some of our training around governance as a leadership practice, where we say that governance has really three kind of horizons that it looks at. The near-term thinking, well, the immediate thinking, your fiduciary responsibilities, your near-term thinking, which is those things which are more strategic in nature, might have an impact in the next 2 to 5 years, and then your generative thinking, which is probably about your 10, 15, 20-year plan. And within that model, we would say you probably want to spend about 65% of your agenda on your fiduciary responsibilities, those things which you need to sign off, they're binary decisions. Do we approve the budget? Do we approve this policy? Yes or no? Maybe about 30% of your agenda on strategic discussions, less likely to be binary, more likely to have multiple options available, need for discussion, need for greater consideration. And then maybe 5% of your agenda on that generative space. What is the long-term view and how do we achieve it? And what we'd say is that might be the breakdown on paper, but in practice, you're probably spending the opposite amount of time. So you're spending significantly more time on the strategic discussions, even though they may only be 1 or 2 points, and less time on your agenda on the fiduciary matters, which are more binary in nature. And you should be able to make a decision relatively quickly over something which is either approved or not. With that generative space, though, I think comes the opportunity to talk about not only what do we want to see this organisation achieve in the next 20, 30, 50 years, but also how can we reflect on our ability to support the organisation to deliver that? And that, I think, is where you get your ways of working conversation. So it doesn't need to be a huge proportion of your agenda. You don't need to be spending a huge amount of time on it, but it is worth making sure it's factored in and making sure it's factored in regularly. So you may consider that in a 2-hour meeting, you ensure you always spend the last 10 minutes on board reflection, saying, how effective have we been as decision makers today? Did we make use of all of the skills and attributes we have around the table? Were we thoughtful and strategic in our decision making? Do we feel we engaged in good governance? And even asking some of those questions will support a constructive conversation on the way that you work together to be really effective. So it doesn't need to be a huge amount of time, but I think little and often really valuable. Got a couple more questions, and then we'll move into our smaller groups to look at our case studies, but I'll answer these 2 first. What's the optimum duration of a board meeting in order to maintain energy levels and quality of the meeting? Particularly considering many participants could have a 2 to 3 hour commute each way, and others may have longer and might have an eye on the clock in order to catch a train. This is not a possible question for me to answer simply, because I think it vastly depends on your organisation, your board, how you're working and who you've got involved. If you're meeting more regularly, so if you're meeting on a monthly basis, then you would probably find yourselves having shorter meetings of maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours. If you're meeting quarterly, which is more common for boards, then we would typically see board meetings being anywhere from 3 to 5 hours long. And that's including the consideration of the commuting time. If you are having someone who is travelling for quite a significant distance, usually they want that to be very worthwhile. And so having a longer meeting can often mean that we achieve more with our time and we're able to be more effective as decision makers because we're not rushing conversations. But equally, of course, there is a fatigue aspect, and we need to make sure that no matter what our length of meeting and no matter what mode, so if you're having online meetings or hybrid meetings, always thinking about those hygiene factors. How regularly are we having breaks? Do we have refreshments available? Are we checking in with people and making sure that they're still present, okay to continue, that they haven't been looking at their screen for too long, and so on. So I'm sorry to the person who asked that question, because there is no one straightforward answer. The most common thing we see would be anywhere between 3 to 5 hours, but it does depend on the nature of your organisation and the needs of your business. Oh, we've had loads more questions come in since I said I wasn't going to answer any more questions. A couple are specifically about cultivating good behaviours. And then a couple are about face-to-face meetings or online, and value of in-person versus hybrid or virtual meetings. So I'll take the two in chunks. When we think about mode of meeting, is there an optimum mix of face-to-face versus online? I think, again, this really depends on the construction of your board and your ability of the people that you have involved to meet in one mode or another. If you have a more local group of people, then meeting face-to-face might be quite straightforward. If you've got a more distributed board, it might be worth considering alternating between an online and an in-person gathering to make it slightly easier for those people who are travelling a further distance. Is it vital that all members have met each other in person? Probably not vital, but valuable. And if board members can't meet in person, it is worth them intentionally engaging with one another on a one-to-one basis. So when you have new people joining your board, encourage them to have a call with each of their fellow trustees so they have a bit of an understanding of one another in that more individual format, even if they haven't met face-to-face. I think that can often be the value of an in-person meeting, is that we benefit from a wider range of view of behaviours. When we're engaging in a situation like this, there are certain behaviours which are evident, but others which are less so. You can see some of my body language. For example, I'm quite an expressive person. I use my hands quite a lot, but we can't all see one another. Everyone on this call isn't currently looking at one another to know how we're feeling. We're not all analysing one another's facial expressions. We're not necessarily paying a lot of attention to tone of voice, or able to if most people are on mute. So there are a lot of factors in communication which get lost in this mode, but which we see more clearly when we're interacting in person. So there is a lot of value in having those interpersonal opportunities, even though they can be more difficult to put together. And then just to look at a couple of these questions around a culture of creating the right behaviours, culture of safety, and cultivating positive behaviours. Really, I think a lot of this is about having a mutual understanding of what good looks like, having the conversation to understand how we interpret some of this language, what honesty means to me, what trust means to me, what integrity means, understanding how that plays out in practice. I like people to be honest with me, but that doesn't mean that I want them to communicate absolutely everything that's on their mind all of the time. And then being open-minded to the fact that we may have very differing perspectives on some of those things, but then bringing into a more structured, formalized setting, maybe a code of conduct or a ways of working document, what this means for us in practice. And a really simple way of doing that is to have a conversation that starts with the sentences "we are" and "we will." So what do we feel we are inherently? What are those values that lead our role as a decision-making group? And what does that mean we will do? So we are listeners. We will take the time to understand another person's perspective without interrupting them. A really straightforward way of hearing feedback from someone else and then recognizing what could be a poor behavior, where people jump in and seek to make their point rather than listening first. So we are and we will can be a really nice way of framing actually how do we want some of these behaviors to play out for us in practice.